was, if you noticed it, the main burden of a remarkable article by Peter Beinart in the June 10th issue of the New York Review of Books earlier this year. And you can go into this, and he produces actually some really interesting data produced by Fred Luntz. You know who Fred Luntz is. This is Washington. Produced by Fred Luntz for exactly the same people who are described in this article. Because they were afraid they were losing the campus in their terms, they commissioned Luntz. What's going on among young American Jews? And the results are an extraordinary set of data, which are the basis of at least one element in the Beinart article. Now, I think the stress on the decline of support for Israel in the American Jewish community more broadly, and on campus in particular, may be a little exaggerated. But I do think something appears to be changing when you compare things to the way they were a few decades ago, in the 60s or in the 80s, when I can tell you they were quite different. Many factors are at work here. I can't go into this in any length. The Journal of Palestine Studies, which I edit, is actually about to publish an article which goes into some of the ways in which new media have an impact on this. It'll probably be not in this coming issue, the issue after that, I'm not sure. But I suggest you all look it up when it's published. Many factors are at work here, notably the access of alternative information and views via the internet, which enables young people, all of whom seem to be extremely technically savvy, to compile their own view of the world. In doing this, they often rely on sources closer to events than the mainstream media, blogs, YouTube, newspapers, satellite TV stations in the Middle East, publishing in English or in other languages, and all kinds of sources of information which we simply didn't have in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. In the face of this changing landscape, the Israel advocacy establishment has mounted a number of initiatives all over the landscape, but especially on U.S. campuses. These have included redoubling efforts to positively brand Israel for public opinion generally, but especially for college students. They've included extraordinarily expensive programs to send even more young people to Israel on what I call magical mystery propaganda tours, but you can call them what you want, Hasbara tours, whatever. They include the establishment of scores, literally scores, of Israel studies programs and chairs on U.S. campuses. At the same time, there's been an increase in attempts to exert external pressure on American universities. This involves the mobilization of the media, the mobilization of politicians, the mobilization of off-campus organizations, and sometimes the mobilization of a few outspoken alumni. At many universities, these pressures have thus far been successfully resisted. But at other universities, administrators have caved in when confronted with the attack dog methods of their critics. The record shows that administrators will often not stand up to such powerful outside forces on their own, and will only feel obliged to do so if faculty and students insist on academic freedom, insist on faculty responsibility for curriculum and for the promotion and tenure processes, and insist on the insulation of the university from insidious external influences, especially from politicians and the media and outside groups. Now, let me conclude. I began by suggesting that the realm of ideas was a major battlefield for those who were seeking to establish the Zionist project in Palestine at the expense of its indigenous inhabitants. And I went on to suggest that success in this endeavor was crucial to the success of the project. I don't know whether, as a result of the new diversity of opinion that I think is out there in academia, in the media, and in the public space, but not in the political realm at all, it's too early to tell whether there will be a rapid lessening of the intellectual and with it the political hegemony of a particular Zionist perspective, which has been sustained for most of the 20th century. Certainly, the growing availability of new interpretations than were once available, of new narratives, of alternative of ways of seeing things, mean that Americans can begin to make up their own minds. Something that wasn't possible when they were restricted to one tendentious, stridently pro-Israel interpretation of facts, as was the case until the recent past. I think there's reason for deep short-term pessimism about the outcome of the political process that determines American Middle East policy, which is why I haven't talked about it. There is reason for deep short-term pessimism about the situation in Palestine and the situation in Israel. Both are endlessly depressing. But there are signs, I think, of encouraging positive longer-term trends in the public sphere in this country. This is not a situation that will change rapidly, however. It took generations and a lot of hard work to establish the myths Israel was built on, and it will take years and a lot of hard work to deconstruct them, and for the generations that are not going to change their minds in many cases to lose their influence. This is a matter partly of time and partly of hard work. I think it'll be a long time before the political situation certainly will change, such that we can expect an end to Israeli impunity. Israel will continue to be protected in pretty much anything it chooses to do by our Congress and by our government. But I think the handwriting may be on the wall. I think that the system of domination and control through the calculated, dosed use of violence and overwhelming power that has obtained in the occupied territories for over 43 years, a system based entirely on violence, and that has maintained the dispossession of the Palestinian people for 62 years, cannot be hidden forever. Maybe it can't be stopped, but it can't be concealed, is my point. The brilliantly conceived discursive artifice, a citadel of lies, that has concealed this system of power and control for so long is actually beginning to crumble. Given the acknowledgement, not by people in the Palestine Center or isolated American academics, given the acknowledgement by Israeli leaders, such as former prime ministers Barak and Olmert, that continuation of the status quo, continuation of the occupation, continuation of settlements, which is happening and will continue to happen, I would argue, for the foreseeable future, will inevitably lead to apartheid and worse. The day is clearly coming when this status quo will pass. Maybe a long time for that day to come, but it is, I think, coming. It is up to Israelis and Palestinians in the first instance to dismantle this iniquitous system, this unjust system, this unsustainable system, and to put in place one that is more just. But the last thing I want to say is, while it's essentially up to them there, it's also up to us here. Americans bear a very, very, very heavy responsibility in this matter. We are the 900-pound gorilla on the Middle Eastern stage. The United States has upheld this entire discriminatory, unjust structure ever since 1948, ever since the partition resolution of 1947. Clearly, a beginning in a new direction, at least in the public sphere in this country, has begun. I would strongly argue that true peace with justice in Palestine for both peoples that live there depends on the continuation of this process in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalidi. Just by a show of hands, how many questions do we have so we can get an idea how many we can take at a time? Okay. Please wait till the microphone gets to you so we can hear your question. Also, those viewing online can hear your question. And why don't we start right over here?
Come up here.
Professor Khalidi, a quick look at the map of the West Bank and the Palestine shows.
Is that on? I can hear it. Yeah, keep talking.
Okay, so the reality in the West Bank and Palestine shows that the one-state solution is becoming a reality on the ground rather than alternative solution. To what extent do you think that this one-state solution is gaining support here in the United States among Palestinians and also Americans?
You know, I wish people would talk about changing the state of things in Palestine rather than talking about how many, what I describe as how many states can dance on the head of a pin. There is no one-state solution, and there's no two-state solution in the foreseeable future. There is the status quo, and that's what we're going to have. We have one state. We have one Israeli state between the river and the sea. That's the only sovereign authority that's going to be there for a very long time. In my view, there's nothing that indicates that Israel or the United States is prepared to allow a sovereign, independent Palestinian entity to come into being. It's not just because of the changes on the ground. It's because of very clear positions, most recently by this administration. whereby it's decided to hand over the Jordan River Valley to Israel. I mean, how can you have a Palestinian state without a Jordan River Valley, without Jerusalem, without this, without that? So the premise of your question, I don't disagree with. I don't see a two-state solution in the foreseeable future. But my late friend Tony Judt once said, may he rest in peace, what one politician has done, another politician can undo. There's no reality that's permanent. None of these things are necessarily permanent. I simply see absolutely nothing that's going to change that dynamic. So I don't really think it's very useful to talk about one state or two states at this point. It's interesting, I think, to talk about how do we change this dynamic, especially in this country, which sustains and funds and finances privately and publicly what's happening there, which arms both sides, all sides of every conflict in the Middle East. We profit, as do many other people, from the continuation of the status quo. That's what we should be focusing on. How do we change that situation? Now, whether that leads to an end of the occupation, an end of settlement, and one kind of solution or another kind of solution, we should have our eyes on some kind of justice, some kind of end of discrimination, self-determination for everybody, and protection of everybody's rights. And we should focus on changing the status quo. But frankly, if you're interested in what you're going to see in the next 10 or I don't know how many years, you're going to see a continuation of the status quo, a one-state solution, which I certainly don't think most people, when they talk about one-state solution, are particularly happy with. So that's my response to any question about the one-state and the two-state solution.
We had a hand up, the lady in the white shirt over here, Hanny.
I'm going to take my jacket off.
Hi,
There's a steam bath in here.
I was wondering if you think the emergence of J Street is significant in terms of changing what it means to be pro-Israeli in America, or for any other reason?
I think that there are a number. Yeah, the question was, do I think that the emergence of J Street has changed what it means to be pro-Israeli in America?
Tell us what J Street is.
J Street is a new lobby that claims to be pro-Israel and pro-peace, and which is, I think, self-described as, or is described by many as an alternative to AIPAC. I think the emergence of J Street and the emergence of a number of other groups and the emergence of people who are out there speaking and writing and playing, M.J. Rosenberg, I could name a dozen people, Mondo Weiss, Philip Weiss, and Adam Horowitz. There's dozens of people out there with a considerable public presence, is evidence of the change that the Beinart article talked about, that I've talked about, and that anybody with a brain to see or has come on a U.S. college campus can tell you is underway. And not just in the Jewish community, throughout important segments of American society. There are other segments that are completely unaffected by this. There are parts of the United States, there are parts of the evangelical community, there are very important segments, especially the older segments of various communities, the Jewish community and others, who are not going to change. They're not changing, they're not going to change. And they're people who vote, they're people who have influence. So that doesn't mean that everything is changing. But at a certain level, I think what J Street represents, I'm not talking about the specific positions it takes, is something that indicates that there is a change. You wouldn't have seen something like this 30 or even 20 years ago.
Lady right here.
Lady in purple.
Of course, I agree with you when you say that the intellectual basis of Israeli political dominance in this country are very important to come to terms with. But I'm worried that this means that whatever happens on the ground is not as important in shaping whether or not this Israeli political dominance continues. In other words,
Yeah, that's your point.
As things on the ground look like it's going to be apartheid and continue to deteriorate, wouldn't this also lead to a change in the position of Israeli political dominance? Or is it that Americans don't read, don't know, don't want to know, and therefore it's not important?
I would actually say that the changes on the ground have been an important factor in changing views in this country among the people I'm talking about. I mean, I talk to students all the time, and a lot of them go there. And many of them go on these magical mystery tours, or they go for their cousin's bar mitzvah, or they go for whatever reason they go, religious tourism, Christian or Jewish kids. And some of them come back with their views reinforced, and those are, that's fine. But a lot of them are actually seeing the reality that you're talking about, what the structure of dominance and control and this controlled use of violence actually means. And it's something that Israelis, most of them don't see. Only the ones who serve in the occupied territories ever see it. Most Israelis don't see it. They don't want to see it. They're insulated from it. It's 2 minutes away from them, but it's a universe away. I don't think a lot of people in a lot of American cities see what happens in a lot of American